Well, hello, Rivers Crossing family. If you've been with us, we are now on episode 3 of our Stuck Together podcast. We're just kind of supplementing the series that we're in as a church. Our first 2 episodes are out. You should go find those. If you haven't listened to those yet, go ahead and pause this one, go back and check those out. They're short. First one's on conflict. The second one is on communication. And today we're going to make a turn. We're going to pivot today. And we're going to talk about some parenting stuff. So if you haven't watched the other episodes, you don't know. This is my lovely wife, Tina. And the reason she's joining us today is not just because she's my wife and we parent 3 amazing kids together, but because she is an expert in this field. So she's a therapist for families, for kids as well, does a lot with broken relationships. She's got degrees in sociology and social work, and one of those people with a lot of fancy letters after their name. So she's an expert, so we wanted to kind of just have a conversation. We have a lot of these conversations because I'm a learner and I always like to learn. So I'm always asking my wife, what does this mean? What does this mean? What does this mean? And then I can bring some stuff maybe from a scriptural standpoint. So thanks for doing this. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Diving into some parenting stuff today. We'll set this up on the front end. You and I are big, especially because all 3 of our kids are adopted as well. You and I are big on their story is their story. So I love to preach and even some other public speaking stuff from places of vulnerability. I love it. But we're going to pull away from that today and just want people to know on the front end. Not going to take our kids' stories today and use those. All 3 of them have amazing stories that I hope they find ways to share and use on their own someday. Our oldest son, Malachi, leans into that pretty heavily, which I love. Kid's a little evangelist for sure. So if anyone is looking for that, just want to set that expectation on the front end that we'll probably let our kids' stories say their stories. And maybe we'll share some light things, but they'll be from our places instead of from their places. But today we wanted to talk about the sun and the moon. So I brought this up to you years ago. Was in kind of a men's group and we were reading books together and read a book called How to Really Love Your Child by Ross Campbell, which I think you have read as well. It's one of the, I'm a huge reader. It's one of the books that I have read multiple times, underlined fresh stuff in it every time. And probably, I would say, probably one of the top 5 most impactful books in my life because of what it did for me parenting-wise. Just changed who I was as a parent, I think, definitely for the better. So he talks in his book and says something very powerful that I shared in my message on Sunday at length, talking about this subject of kids and parents are like the sun and the moon. And at night, we look up at the moon and we think, man, the moon is providing, a nice big full moon is providing a lot of light. But in reality, the moon provides no light. The moon simply reflects the sun. And when you come at parenting from that perspective, your kids are the moon and the parents are the sun. The kids are only reflecting back to the parents what they see from the parents, what they get from the parents. So if you want love and affection from your kids, but don't give them love and affection, you won't get love and affection. You know, if you want your kids to respect boundaries, if you want your kids to be on time, then they have to see that represented. So wanted to ask you, as someone who has a number of kids come into her office, are there struggles that kids have where their parents are violating this concept, where their parents have an expectation of my kid should give me this, even though they're not giving that to their kid to start that cycle?
Yeah, it's interesting because I always see it as if children had jars, like clear jars, and we deposit into those. And what happens is if we're not depositing in, like emotional deposit, but we're trying to always withdraw from their jars, there's nothing in there. We haven't filled their jars with enough to withdraw anything, or for them to even pull a withdrawal out themselves and give it to you. And so many times is that we forget that probably some things that are going on with our children is a reflection of maybe their environment. And there's the concept of biosocial, right? Some things are just biological. Some things happen because of the biological chemistry, how we were made up. And some of it is very social. So it speaks to that nature-nurture place, is that most of the time we don't want to pause and think about, is the environment that we as parents have created contributing to anything that's going on with my children?
Yeah.
And what is happening is parents want their children to be this like great representation of them, right? That's why parents get frustrated with kids with sports and how their kid is not the best, and then we push them. You know, that reality is most of the time we're looking for them to be a reflection of us. But what have we done to contribute that? And we only want them to make us look good, not even about the child.
Yeah.
And so yes, I have kids that come in and all the time they're like, I don't know, this is what I do because it makes my parents happy, or I don't talk about these things because it makes my parents unhappy. The children has now become the emotional thermometer of their parents.
Yeah, I thought through that because you and I think both leaned into Malachi recently after he had a bad football game a few weeks ago, and maybe not a bad game, but below his standard of play. Made a couple mental mistakes, got a couple.
He had some struggles.
He did at the start of the game, and I pushed him a little bit. Meanwhile, there's nothing wrong with obviously coaching and pushing and challenging of, hey, you are below your own bar that you've set for quality here, step up a little bit. But, that's me restraining because I want to lean in heavily of like, get your head right, and really lean into it, which I didn't. But coming from that perspective of they won the game, he had a blast. He was amazing, afterwards was high-fiving his teammates and everyone's congratulating each other. And
are you leaning into him to make him better because you see the potential in him? Are you leaning into him so that you look better?
Right.
And that you feel better about your parenting?
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So what you said there is I'm already picturing myself and kind of laughing of like, oh, I did this recently of, why am I so passionate about making sure he doesn't get a holding penalty? Yeah. It's me, right? Because I'm like, oh, I wouldn't have got a holding penalty right there, So, it's that balance of, am I frustrated because I see potential in you? Or am I frustrated because I feel like you owe me something right here?
You wanted some emotional deposit back into you.
I wanted my feel good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right? It was no longer about the child. It's about the parent.
Yeah. And even we would spin that as trying to make it about the kid of like, I want to be able to brag about you. I want to be able to say like, that's my son. But it wasn't that. I want to be able to say that's my son because I want to emphasize the my part, right? I taught him that in the backyard kind of stuff. It's we've hit this now 3 weeks in a row of it's not always about me when it comes to parenting, right? And I think when you have that perspective of the sun and the moon, it really kind of enforces some of that stuff. Something else that Ross Campbell says in that book is that we have this expectation on our kids to meet our needs, and it's quite frankly unacceptable. It's not their responsibility to meet any of our needs, to give us love, to satisfy us. If we have a bad day at work and we come home and our expectation is for our kids to fix this bad day, that feels super disjointed, right?
Yeah, there's so many times that I'll be talking to kids, and kids are a lot more insightful than we even realize. They're a lot more in tune with things than we actually are as adults. They'll talk to me, and I'll be talking with them, and I hear it a lot from teenagers that they will limit what they share because they don't want to hurt their parent. And so, like, imagine if you have this teenage daughter or teenage son who's going through something, right? They're still learning, right? Their brains are not even fully developed. They are. It is okay for them to make mistakes because they are still learning. But they withhold what is going on in their own lives so that they can meet the emotional need of their own parent, when it should be roles reversed. That is a place that leans heavily into more of an enmeshed space, that children, are only there to fix an emotional need for their parent. What are we teaching them as they grow up then? Like, how heavy is that for a child? Yeah. That they feel like they have to withhold something or be a certain way so that mom or dad is happier. Mom and dad feel loved. Mom and dad's emotions are correct. Mom's not sad anymore. Dad's not angry anymore. I fixed it because if I do these things, they've learned. It's a learned behavior. and they know how to respond to that parent's needs. They are not there to fix our emotional needs. They are there for us to teach and to train and to love. Love, how to really love your kid is not for them to really love you. And I think that's where we miss parenting so many times. I think we have it reversed. We feel like, and a lot of times kids come into my room and I'm working with the children and they grow and develop and do well. And I have to tell the parent, like, they're at a capacity because you've put a ceiling on them, because what's going on in the environment or what's going on with your own emotional needs has to be addressed in order for them to grow. How do we remove that? How can they continue to grow past their parent in that situation? And that's the hard part, is people don't really want that. We have to do self-reflection with that.
Yeah, it's almost like, you hear a lot about this in like leadership stuff. I think it's maybe John Maxwell who started the idea of the law of the lid, and your employees can't grow past you. So if you're not growing, your employees can't grow. You will lid them forever. But you can easily bring that same concept into the home, right? If you're not maturing emotionally, if you're not continuing to grow, if you're not setting a good example for your kids, whatever language you want to put to it, if you're not on some sort of journey yourself, then you have lidded your family, your kids as well, right? Like you've prevented that. Let me ask you this, because I would imagine a lot of people hear that and they're like, wow, that sounds like a broken family, but how common is that?
It's average. I mean, it's what we see. We're not perfect. We all have some form of it. We don't want to. It's just sometimes we all have some form of it. The capability is just learning from that and being willing to like make changes into your family system. That, okay, like obviously I've been using my child to help meet my emotional need of sadness, like, okay, maybe we need to go and figure out the reason we're sad and not our kid trying to figure out how to fix it. And so that we have to own some of that as parents. Like, it is our responsibility to train them up in the way they should go, not to train them up by making them our emotional support person. It's not what their role is. We're supposed to teach them those things, not default teaching.
Yeah. Or, bad day at work, so you come home and I feel like this goalpost moving on a kid of like, whoa, I know the dishes need to get done, but last week it was a quick reminder. This week it was exploding. Next week's back to a quick reminder. And just putting kids in this place of, I don't even know what emotion to expect. I don't even know where the line is. They're feeling that they have to meet needs, but then even changing the need to begin with of sometimes it's okay, sometimes it's the worst thing ever, sometimes the sky is falling, sometimes my parents are happy. Yeah.
It's the inconsistency. And so many times, I see it a lot with, if there is any, like, parents have their own childhood trauma or they have their own broken family systems that they came from, is they're trying to rectify that now because the lid was on for them as a child. And now they're trying to learn that now as an adult. And so many times that learning can get a little messy with kids. And so trying to make sure we are keeping things in the lane that they need to be in, not using our kids as the scapegoat for it. Like that reality is, like you said, like the dishes weren't done. Why am I so angry with my daughter that the dishes aren't done? That's a me issue. It's not a her issue. But I've made it her issue. And what I've taught her is something unhealthy. That she's never good enough, that she's never going to meet the standard, that there's always something wrong with her. These are the internal messages that children get from these type of situations. Like, I'm never going to meet the standard.
Yeah, and it's easy I think as a parent to hear that and go, come on.
Well, look at your own childhood.
Dishes should be done, right? That's what I was gonna say.
Step it back.
Right, and also think about, everyone would agree that decision making is lacking until your early 20s. Science even backs that up. Your frontal lobe isn't fully developed and things like that. So we would agree that a 13-year-old is not fully developed mentally with decision making. But yet we would look at that situation and be like, come on, they don't really feel that way. Yeah, yes, they feel that way. They feel inadequate. They feel like there's a bar that they have to hit.
I would disagree because I have too many sitting in my office.
Yeah.
Use those exact words. That I never meet their expectations. I'm never going to be good enough. What is the point of me even trying? And that speaks to anxiety, depression, and most of the time behaviors acting out because they need someone to validate who they are.
So is that, and I'm more direct than you sometimes, although maybe in this space you're as direct or more direct than I am, but would you say that that is lazy parenting or uneducated parenting?
I would say it's learned parenting.
Okay.
I would say that it comes from somewhere, that it maybe has become a part of our subconscious, that how we grew up, we've interpreted parenting that it needed to go a certain way because of something we did receive or we didn't receive. And so we just kind of try to formulate it in our own way of thinking. We try to create a plan for ourselves. And that's where I see most of the time is it's learned somewhere. We taught ourselves or someone's taught us.
Yeah.
And the reality of that is that that's the piece that becomes that, you talk about the sun and the moon, is like sun has to decide like how they're going to shine. And so that piece of it has to be is that, are we looking at it? Are we being perceptive? Are we having some reflection? Are we being insightful? Looking at like, am I contributing to something here? Or am I repeating something here that I didn't want repeated?
Mm. Yeah.
But I'm trying hard. I think most parents truly try. They want to do right by their children most of the time.
Well, they wouldn't bring their kid to your office if they weren't, I broke something here, help me fix this. Yeah.
But the piece is that we bring them to my office to say that there's something wrong with them. And that component is we have to have some self-reflection, like your daughter struggles with anxiety. It's a biological maybe, or could also be environmental that contributes to that. And we have to pause and think like, if there's an environmental component, what is that and how can I change that?
Yeah. That's hard, right? I know that I just had this conversation. We have 3 kids, which obviously but there's other people listening.
I know we have 3 kids. Yeah.
Our daughter, Micah, is about to turn 13 in 2 months, about a month. And then Malachi, our oldest son, is 11, going on 12, and Cyrus about to turn 8 as well. So they're all about to level up. And so definitely got, in that preteen, life right now. And you and I had a conversation a few months back about parenting our kids differently. And I ended up having a conversation with our daughter, Micah, about that. And even asking for grace, not even for anything specific, just for parenting overall, where I told her, I was like, hey, just so you know, you're the first kid we've ever parented. So sometimes you're going to feel like, well, Malachi got to do that and I didn't get to do that. And he's only 15 months younger than I am. I think Kai gets to stay up a little bit later right now as an 11-year-old than we let her stay up as an 11-year-old. And she made, a kind of passive aggressive comment about it. Not really mad, but just kind of like, I want to make sure I'm gonna make a little deposit here, so maybe I can withdraw it a little bit later to get some extra grace on something. And I told her, I was like, I don't know if this is an apology or not, but you were the first 11-year-old we had ever parented. So we made this decision, and he's the second 11-year-old we ever parented, and we'll have a third 11-year-old, and you'll be the first 13-year-old we ever parented, and you'll be the first one in the family to drive, and the first one that we send to college, and a lot of firsts for us, and we're going to make more mistakes with you than the other two, and that I'm sorry for, and just like this super healthy conversation that we had where I was just coming to her, but just from a place of honesty and vulnerability, and again, maybe not apologetic, but just framing the expectation for her of, you're our first, so things are going to kind of change as we go along the way. And I loved where the conversation, that I won't share all the details of it, but where it ended up going between her and I, of just from being honest about it. And it like totally shifted her perspective. It was like one day.
There's a place of self-awareness.
Yeah, that's where I was trying
You
to
were
get
willing
at.
to be
Yeah.
self-aware and then communicate. I mean, we talked about communication, and then you communicated that. You were vulnerable. You came to a shared space with her about that piece. We're probably going to not do this really well. It's that place of the idea of, I always use the airplane analogy, but there's a reason why they ask you to put your oxygen mask on first, because you are no good to anyone else if you don't have oxygen first. You can't help your child if you haven't put the oxygen mask on yourself. So it's teaching self-care. We have to learn to take care of ourselves so that our children are not the ones having to take care of us. Your child's on the plane. If they're old enough to hear to put the oxygen mask on first to themselves, they're going to put it on. And then they're going to look at you and say, what's going on? Why aren't you breathing? They're going to have to be the one to put it on you because you're over there fumbling around trying to get someone else's mask on. No, put the mask on first so your kid doesn't have to put it on for you. Like, they're not the ones there to help you keep breathing. You are there to continue their journey. And so that whole concept is self-care, self-awareness, self-insight. Like, I know I have to, it's not selfish. It's care so that I can care. We're only as good to others as we are good to ourselves. And so in order for us to instill things into our children, to put the emotional deposits into them, instead of them constantly emotionally depositing into us, we have to start taking care of ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And then I wanted to circle back as well to this idea of how do we correct in moments, without turning our kids into their own little sons where we expect something from them. You generate and give me love that I haven't given to you first. How do we discipline around that without making that feel so overwhelming for them, or getting to a place of, because the reality is the dishes got to get done. It is a chore. So how do you have that conversation appropriately? How do you potentially discipline appropriately? I know for me, I think I've shared this maybe in the first episode about, my family upbringing and my father definitely disciplining for behaviors. And I think I shared with you early on, we were probably just kind of dating and was sharing about how I was disciplined growing up. And you were like, that's abuse. And I'm like, no, it's fine. And then processing a little bit more, having our own kids and being like, I'd never do that. I would never do that to my own kids, but definitely, I mentioned this book was very impactful for me. And it was along those lines of discipline that the book was so impactful for me as a parent, because I realized that parenting behaviors through means of physical discipline, whatever you want to put underneath the category of physical discipline. I think for me, it was, looking back on it now as a 40-year-old, it was probably abuse. It was abuse. That my dad would have denied was abuse, right? I'm trying to get, I've told him 10 times and, my kids are sneaking out, my boys are sneaking out doing drugs in the middle of the night. Like, I've got to address this. And this idea of physical abuse or spanking, whatever label you want to put on it, for me, being fully vulnerable, that turned me into a very lazy parent, because I knew if I spanked, and we're talking about with our kids, spanking was not what I went through as a child, but we're looking at any sort of physical punishment for something, I would get the result I wanted quickly. I get attention, I get a commitment to never do it again, and I feel like I've won as a parent, and I've lost as a parent. It turned me into a lazy parent. Now it's much harder and it's much more time consuming to lean in, to have a conversation, to allow a kid to talk to you, not talk back to you, but to talk to you, to push back, to tell you where they're coming from so you can discipline from a place appropriately, so you could have conversations with your child. And man, I felt like when I was the same age as our oldest son, Kai, that I was getting disciplined all the time for the same things. And maybe he's just a better kid than I was. But I think the conversations that we've been able to have are so much more motivating for behavioral change. And that would be the challenge that I, from a pastoral experience / parenting experience, would give to anyone watching the podcast, would be lean into hard communication with your kids. Have the conversation. Understand that you are the one speaking into them, not the other way around. And if you're willing to have those harder conversations, you will start to see the behavioral changes that you want out of a desire from their part to have behavioral change, instead of just disciplining to get the result you want. Like, maybe back up a touch. Like, do you see those kind of situations walk into your office?
Yeah, I always tell parents it's not cookie cutter. So you have to look at the child and their needs. You have to look at their personality. You have to look at their behaviors and work from that. that you don't just walk in and thinking like consequences have to look the same way for every child. First, we have to teach them what the expectation is and what the boundary is. Because if we constantly are disciplining them for something they don't know, it's not really fair to them. And they're in uncharted territory, which creates anxiety. That's uncertainty. So I think that the thought process is first know your child. Be clear about what boundaries or expectations or rules or whatever you want, but then teach them cause and effect. It's a life lesson we need. So teaching cause and effect, that if we don't do the dishes, if we don't take out the trash, if we don't do our homework, these are the things that may impact us. You may lose privileges. You may not be able to play on one of your teams because your grades are not, you're teaching this life lesson through it. And I think that's the key component, is that we want to discipline how we probably were disciplined, or we go far the other way and we discipline opposite. But we have to look at the child. This is about the child. So what do they need, not what do I need? And so, each of our 3 children are very different. We have to train them up a little differently with the same life lessons, but just different approaches. And that speaks to who they are. They're allowing them to be an individual. They're allowing some space of differentiation, which is what kids need versus what you need. And most of the time we discipline or correct out what we need, not what they need.
Yeah. Oh, it's so challenging. Let's wrap up with some tangible stuff again. I always like to give people takeaways. So my recommendation would be that book by Ross Campbell, How to Really Love Your Child. I could never recommend that book enough to pick that up and to read that. He does have some offshoots that I haven't read of How to Love Your Teen Child or Your Angry Child, or so there's some other avenues out there that you could check out. And then if I'm hearing you correctly, a couple of your recommendations, and feel free to add to these, would be have peace to parent your kids differently. If you have 4 kids, they might have 4 different parenting plans. And then the other one would be to feed into your kids instead of trying to pull something out of them that you haven't already spent time pulling into them. Anything else you would add to that? It's kind of some tangible parenting tip.
No, I think that pretty much covers it. Is, just remember you're the pitcher that's supposed to be full. They are the glass that came to you empty. And we get the liquid from the pitcher, not from the glass. And so just keeping that in mind of like our role versus their role. Let's not mix those up.
That's very good. Well, thank you for doing this once again. I know parenting's a hard topic, and you and I could probably have this conversation for 5 hours and still not scratch the surface of it. So thanks. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
You got one more in you?
Sure.
All right. Well, we'll do one more in a week.
One more.
See you then.